As Thursday dawned in Jerusalem, it was like any other Thursday. It was the eve of Passover, which would begin an 8-day-long feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So this is a common springtime feast, and Passover is something that has been happening literally for thousands of years at this point, going clear back to the Exodus. And so Jesus asks two of his disciples to go and prepare the Passover meal. And he directs them to a place where there will be a room. And this room becomes known as the upper room. And so Peter and John go and they probably spend the day preparing the Passover meal, which would have been consisting of a very traditional menu consisting of roasted pork and roasted pork, wow. If you are Jewish, please forgive me. Roasted lamb. How's that? Does that sound better? Roasted pork. Where did that come from? Wow. Anyway, consisting of roasted lamb and different things that would remind them of their exodus. And so as this meal is being prepared, by sundown, they begin to gather in the upper room for this meal, which we call now the Last Supper. And Jesus did something very unusual during this Last Supper. He began to take what were common elements in the meal and give them new meaning, or to reassign meaning to them. So he took the bread, for example, and he said, this bread now, breaking it, represents his body, the body of the new covenant. And then he took the wine, and he said, the wine represents his blood of the new covenant. And so he was establishing something here that would have been foreign to them, this new covenant. What's this about? But he's giving new meaning to the age-old symbols that they have been celebrating in the Passover for many, many years, all of the lifetimes of everyone who would be in that room. And then you can begin to see some of the tension of the evening. Now, I'm convinced that they didn't go into this evening thinking this is the day that Jesus is going to die. He's been telling them this for literally months at this point. As they've been traveling around ministering, he's been letting them know that they are going to Jerusalem where the Son of Man will be turned over. He will be beaten and crucified, dead and buried, but he will rise again. He's been giving them that message, but I think that evening, that wasn't first and foremost on their mind. Jesus has another little interesting conversation. He says that one of the men in this room, now these are his 12 disciples, those closest to him that have been with him and ministered with him and have seen all the miracles. One of these 12 is going to betray him. That would be a stunning thing to say. And so as they are looking around the room, they all begin to ask themselves, is it me? Is it me? And Judas, who happens to be sitting right next to him, says, is it me? And Jesus confirms, you know, it's you. You've already taken the money. I mean, yes, the one who's dipping his hand in the dish with me. And Judas gets up and he tells him, go and do what you have to do. And so Judas leaves, and then this bizarre scene breaks out. And I can only, it's like, imagine your family Thanksgiving dinner, right? And you have the uncle who comes who always brings up the topic that gets everybody fighting. That's what happened here. It's like all of a sudden, they start bickering among themselves about who's going to be the greatest. I mean, right as Jesus is instituting the new covenant, and there's this somberness, I mean, it's the Passover, and they start bickering among themselves as far as who is going to be the greatest. And I think what we're seeing here is that starting with this dinner, clear through the next 24 hours, we see more intense spiritual warfare than we have ever seen at any time in this earth. Many times it says Satan was involved in this. Now, understand, Satan is not God. Satan is not omnipresent. Satan is not omniscient. Satan is a created being. So when Satan is in the room, That's a unique situation. We talk often about doing battle with Satan, but we are doing battle against his kingdom. We are doing battle against his forces, but we are never in battle with Satan himself. Satan himself was there in Jerusalem that week, and he was intensely trying to bring division and doubt and denial and ultimately discouragement to those around Jesus. And so they end this dinner, and the Bible tells us that they ended by singing a hymn, and then they left and they went to the Mount of Olives, and they begin a time of prayer in the garden. And again, Jesus is warning them, be ready. In fact, he's already warned Peter that Satan has asked to sift him and that Jesus will pray for him. And Satan says, yeah, right, I'm strong. Remember, I'm Peter. And Jesus says, no, before this night is over, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter doesn't believe him. He doubts what Jesus is telling him. He's like, never, Lord, I would never do that. As they're praying, a company of soldiers begin to approach with Judas leading the way. He comes and he kisses Jesus, the kiss of betrayal. And they ultimately end up arresting Jesus, and they take him first to what will become a series of trials, starting with the Jewish religious leaders. So he has 3 trials starting probably early Friday morning. And the first of those trials, he is accused of blasphemy. Now, blasphemy is a sin punishable by death according to Jewish law. And they really have no trouble finding him guilty of this sin, because there's multiple occasions where he has indicated that he is God. And so they have brought this charge of blasphemy up to him and ultimately convict him of death. The problem is the Jews do not have the authority to put someone to death. To do that, they need to take it to the Romans. So they take Jesus to the governor of the area, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. He has the authority to put Jesus to death. The problem is blasphemy is not a crime according to Roman law. So they accuse Jesus of insurrection. Remember, what were they proclaiming him on Palm Sunday, the day that we just celebrated? The king, right? That's treason. That's rebellion against Rome. And so they bring Jesus before Pilate and they say, this man is guilty of insurrection. He claims he's the king of the Jews. And Pilate questions him, do you claim to be the king of the Jews? And Jesus confirms that he does. But Pilate still is not convinced. So he sends him to Herod. Now, Herod is the puppet king over this region. His power comes from the Romans, so he's more of a showpiece than anything. But he sends him to Herod because Jesus is from Galilee and he's a Jew, and he thinks maybe Herod will deal with him. Herod has no interest in dealing with Jesus. In fact, he's actually, I think, more attracted by the celebrity of Jesus, the fact that, this person he's heard so much about is now standing here with him. And I kind of picture him having selfies taken with Jesus, and he doesn't really spend any time. I mean, he's not interested in putting him in trial. And so he sends him back to Pilate. Now, Pilate is in a tough spot because he doesn't believe Jesus is guilty of insurrection. And yet, by this time, the Jewish officials have drawn up a huge crowd outside of Pilate's place. And I would picture this being several hundred, perhaps even thousands of people who are gathered outside of Herod's palace. And the Jewish officials have started really agitating this crowd and getting them wound up. And so Pilate has an idea. As is custom during the feast, he will pardon one criminal. And so he brings before them Jesus, whom Pilate declares is innocent. Here's this rabbi Jesus, or I will pardon this notorious murderer named Barabbas. You choose. He's thinking, this is obvious. Nobody's going to pardon. Everybody knows Barabbas is the murderer. Jesus has done nothing wrong. He thinks this is an easy way out of a tight spot. But the Jews have outsmarted him here. The Jewish leaders are out there. And I kind of picture this, you've seen that movie Rudy, where they start, Rudy, Rudy, right? I think the Jewish leaders are out there with that crowd, and they're going, crucify him, crucify him. And the crowd begins to pick it up. And they're just, before long, they're chanting in unison, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And so Pilate looks and he says, who should I pardon, Jesus or Barabbas? And the crowd answers, Barabbas, Barabbas. What do I do with Jesus? Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And so Pilate, not wanting the guilt of this on his conscience, brings out a basin, washes his hands of it in front of all the people and says, his guilt is on you. I find this man to be innocent. But he still condemns him to death, and Jesus is taken and beaten. And if you've seen the Passion of the Christ, you know the intensity of, he's not even recognizable after they beat him. And the purpose of this was so that when a criminal was placed on the cross, they wouldn't hang there for days. They took them right to the point of death, so that the final act is nailing them to the cross, and then within a short time, they'll die. And so as noon approaches, Jesus is led to Calvary, just outside of the city, and he is hung there on a cross between two criminals. And between noon and 3 p.m., darkness spreads over, the Bible tells us, over the earth. This had to be an incredibly, imagine standing there watching this all take place, and darkness happens. During this time, God is pouring out the sins of the world, past, present, and future, upon Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. Your sins, my sins, are being poured out upon him. And God cannot even look upon his son during this time. And Jesus cries out, Father, why have you forsaken me? Because God has forsaken his own son while he hangs on that cross. And so as 3 p.m. approaches, Jesus is towards the end of his life. And after exchanging a few more words, he finally says, it is finished. And at that point, the area erupts with an earthquake that shakes the entire region. It's so intense, the darkness, the earthquake, all that is happening, that one of the Roman soldiers even remarks, surely this was the Son of God. And so they take Jesus, and as is the custom, he's buried that very evening. So Friday night ends with Jesus in the grave, and his disciples have scattered all over the place. And he has been betrayed by one of his own. He's been forsaken by his Father, and he lays dead in the grave. And we see the strategies of Satan throughout this time, because if you look at Peter doubted Jesus' word when Jesus said, you will deny me. But there's a point in time when a young girl looks at Peter and says, he's one of them. He's from Galilee. I recognize him. And Peter curses. And he says, I do not know the man. I am not part of his clan. And Jesus looks at him the third time, and he hears a rooster crow. That moment destroys Peter. In fact, as we move into the book of John, even though there are rumors that begin to spread about Jesus' resurrection and that he's alive, Peter is defeated. John chapter 21 tells us that Peter looks out at his fellow disciples. Remember, he's the leader of the disciples, and he tells them, I'm going fishing. Now, this is not, I'm going fishing to relax and to de-stress a little. Remember, he's a professional fisherman. This is his job. He's going back to what he knows. He's denied Jesus. He's defeated. He's discouraged. And he looks at his friends and he says to them, I'm going fishing. We've all been there, haven't we? We've all been to a point where we are defeated and discouraged, and we just look at it, it's like, I'm going back to what I do. And praise God, Jesus didn't leave Peter there, and he won't leave you and I there either.